for being here. This was quite an ordeal to get this set up, to say the least. My name is Mary Fleischman. I'm the co-leader of the Bitterbrush Broads. And for those who are not familiar with us, this is what I have here is pretty much what our focus areas are, which is wildland protection, wildlife issues, restoring healthy rivers, climate change, and building relationships. And we do all kinds of things. We have what we call our broad walks, which are hikes. We do a lot of stewardship projects. Tonight, this is what we call a broad chat, when we bring in speakers and so forth. And then we do additional education because sometimes we'll do something more public with different presentations. Obviously, advocacy, and many of you guys are part of our partnerships because we can't do this all on our own. We really welcome our partnerships with the local Sierra Club, the Oregon Wild. Yeah, it's pretty much a lot of what we do. And then, of course, you can look and see, you know, the bottom line is we're all about protection of public lands. And I think some of the newer stuff that we're involved with is, which Amy's going to address some of this, is really looking at some of the, along with climate change is great. Our newest project is kind of looking at grazing issues as well as, you know, just the general abuse of our public lands. So that being said, I've seen some new faces. So starting in the back really quick, you are?
I'm Ryan Houston, I'm an
Anda.
Mark Litterman, friend of Boone, friend of Bitterbrush.
Awesome.
Matthew Faderspiel, I'm with Bitterbrush.
Matt Johnson with Eco Plateau Research.
Oh, nice.
Jen Collins, just Van Dyke.
Matt Snelly.
Michael Bitterbrush. Okay.
Back in the back,
And Julian, also with the Bitterbrush.
but also Oregon Wild.
Yeah. Clark, I'm a broad. Amy Stewart, Bitterbrush Broad.
And of course, who's going to be our presenter tonight. So I'm so glad we've got so many people that are in Zoom, and this is our first time trying to do something like this. So we'll see how this works tonight. Amy, I guess you're next.
Okay, do we want to find out who the people are? You already know.
Well, boy, I can't. We've got like 15 participants. That's a lot of people.
Okay,
So I'll let you go.
okay, all right.
She is up in the corner.
I am in the corner. I can't. So how do I bring up my PowerPoint? Does anybody know?
That might be Matthew.
Maybe. I don't know. I'm winging it over here. Matthew might know. Did you already have it pulled up? It's in
Yeah,
the.
it's on the bottom.
It's on.
Okay, okay, so we just want to make sure we share screen with everybody,
It's
right?
one of these. I can't even see it. So
Okay.
that's
Is it gonna
it.
be this one? Okay, let's make sure that Zoom people can see it though. Are we sharing screen?
I don't know.
Can the folks on Zoom see the PowerPoint?
No, we can't.
Okay.
Awesome.
Not so awesome.
Let's see, yeah.
Just hit the
I
button.
think the one.
Yeah, sure.
There we go.
Right there.
Yes.
Because can you guys see it now?
Yes.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you.
Stay close by, Jamie. Don't you walk too far away.
Improvising.
Okay. And then does this thing switch slides and all that gizmo? Okay. All right. Well, a few of us went out in the Ochocos last week because we wanted to learn about livestock grazing monitoring methods. And we had the good fortune to have a couple of range techs come over from Prairie City Ranger District. And they taught us a lot about how to use techniques. Let's see.
Speak up just a tiny bit.
So, okay, speak up. Okay. Yeah. So we spent 2.5 days out in the field learning how to use a modified Dobenmeyer plot. So I don't know if any of you know what that means, but it's how you measure vegetation when you're looking at grazing impacts on riparian streams. So that's Rinda and one of the range techs helping us. And that's actually a homemade Dobenmeyer plot that Matthew came up with. So 2 teams could actually do this. Whoops, how did I jump to the end already? Here. So just to show you, this is the Ochoco Forest. This is from the 1989 Land and Resource Management Plan, LRMP, we call it for short. And back in 1989, all those red lines there, those are all streams in bad condition. And they're actually still all in bad condition and much worse. Not a big surprise. So just some examples. The stream on the right is Porter Creek. This is one of the ones that we were sampling. And on the left is called Hickory Meadow. And you can see every time a little branch tries to stick its little twig outside of that little, I guess you'd call it closed in area from those T-stakes and wire, it's chomped off. So our streams are in really, really bad shape on the Ochoco, which is not surprising. It's pretty much true west-wide. So we spent a few days in the field and we learned how to use the Dobin-Meyer plot. We had 9 of us out there along with the range techs. And what we tried to do was set up permanent surveying markers using rebar and then identify upper and lower, and then do random sampling and follow what they call the MIMS, the monitoring information method that the BLM and Forest Service uses. So we're trying to be consistent with what they do. And this is the type of things we were looking at. We were collecting information on the key species, the grasses, the rushes, the sedges, the stubble height, the amount of stream bank alteration, and then if there were woody plants like willows, alders, dogwood, some of the key species, cottonwood, then we would gather information on them. Whoops, and we're back to the beginning again. No, not quite, not quite. So just to show that we did have a bunch of fun, there's a bunch of smiling faces. Sometimes we're even goofy because, I mean, fun is one of the cornerstones of being abroad. So that's it. Okay, so, okay. And we can bring up. Boone's. Okay, so I'm going to introduce Boone Kauffman. Nice, it was great to meet you. So I've read so much of your stuff. So Dr. Boone Kauffman, he's a research professor of ecosystems ecology in the Department of Fisheries, Wildlife, and Conservation Sciences at Oregon State University. He's also the lead scientist, and I may get this wrong, Billy, in Sciences International, which is a small international consulting firm specializing on issues relating to natural resources ecology. His research, technology transfer, consulting, and teaching efforts center on understanding dynamic interactions of land use, climate change, and their influence on ecosystem services. Much of his recent work has focused on quantifying the values of coastal wetlands, riparian zones, and forests, and climate change mitigation and adaptation strategies. And we'll hear all about livestock tonight. So it focuses on measuring, ecosystem structure, biodiversity, carbon stocks, greenhouse gas emissions, and carbon sequestration associated with land use and restoration. And much of his work is multidisciplinary in nature, working in collaboration with biological, physical, and social scientists. He leads educational research and technical assistance activities throughout the world. I mean, just listing the places he's doing research is Indonesia, Brazil, the US, Gabon, Liberia, Senegal, Mexico, Costa Rica, Palau, Honduras, United Arab Emirates, and the Dominican Republic. I don't know how you do that. That smell must be up. Do you ever sleep? So he currently contributes to both the International Blue Carbon Science and Policy Working Group on Climate Change and Mitigation. He's a co-author for the 2022 IPCC Special Report that's all about climate change on land use and cover change and forestry. He's a lead author on supplement to the 2006 IPCC guidelines on national greenhouse gas on the wetlands section. He's been a science advisor to the Coalition for Rainforest Nations. He's published, this blew me away, over 260 papers. Like I said, you don't sleep. Over 160 book peer-reviewed papers and book chapters. And way back in some time ago, he received his Ph.D. in forest ecology from Berkeley, University of California. So, and I just wanted to say, I read 2 of his papers that he just contributed or was the lead author this year. One was the livestock use of public lands in the Western US, that how it exacerbates climate change and implications for climate change mitigation and adaptation. That was just this year. And then the most recent one in August, he was a co-author on rewilding the American West, both very stellar publications. They were attached to the invitation. So if you haven't had a chance to read them, by golly, read them. So with that, without further ado, it's all you.
Thanks a lot.
You bet.
As always. This is going weird, isn't it?
Okay, this does not want to behave at
No,
all.
you have to start at the beginning and you start after this with me.
Okay. Where is the beginning? Okay. All right. Hopefully I can get this right. It won't stay still, but anyway, this is me. And I just want to say how delighted I am. And what I'm talking about today is livestock use on public lands. That's the title. Basically the interactions between.
We're not seeing your slides.
Okay, wait a second.
Great, great. I said composition mode. It seemed to be like auto advance. I just have it on the regular. Oh, here we go, here we go. Sorry, can Zoom folks see it or no?
Nope,
No,
can't see it.
Okay, well, one moment.
It says we are screen sharing.
Yeah. We just try again. Oop.
So this is because we're better biologists. than We are engineers.
Okay.
Can y'all see that?
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Is it going?
Well, let us forget about, you know who I am by now. That's me. And here's the title, Livestock Use on Public Lands in the Western United States, Implications on Climate Change. Same thing as the title of the paper. And I just want to say how happy I am to be here and what an honor it always is to get to come talk to the Bitterbrush Broads. This is my second, I think. Anyway, I always like to start off with one of my favorite quotes. Being a professor in wildlife, you always have to have an Aldo Leopold quote. And this has always been one of my favorite ones, and ones that you all are becoming more and more familiar with. I think is like the penalties of an ecological education is that we live alone in a world of wounds, and the damage inflicted on land is quite visible to the lay people. And this is the North Fork of the Mount Here, for example. This is a wild and scenic river, and hundreds of people, maybe at least a few people anyway, go by the site every day, yet not even realizing the incredibly degraded condition of both the river, the simplified river, the way it's wide and narrow, or wide and shallow, and with no riparian vegetation. So, and an ecologist and or an activist such as yourself must either harden their shell and make believe that the consequences of science are none of their business, or they must be the doctor who sees the marks of death in a community that believes itself well and does not want to be told otherwise. You know, the first, I think, what's always denial is the first stage of any disease. What I'm going to talk about today, what I'm going to talk about this, what's near and dear to all of our hearts are public lands, you know, the Western United States, you know, the most, could we turn off the lights? It's really a glare for me. Among the most majestic biologically landscapes of North America. And these are very, very important, I think, for all of us. They're a source of pride and inspiration. I think one of the greatest aspects of America is this inspiration they provide for the millions who recreate, depend upon them for ecosystem services. This includes clean air, water, unfragmented fish and wildlife habitats, migratory corridors. They deliver abundant sources of water and other natural resources for agriculture, domestic use downstream. And sad to say, though, the structure and function of these ecosystems are increasingly threatened by the synergistic effects of current land use and climate change. And that's largely what I want to address today. You know, just to kind of back up a little bit globally, you know, there's an unequivocal evidence now through IPCC in the United States panel on climate change that Earth is warming at unprecedented rates. And we can base this on multiple lines of evidence: unprecedented temperature rise, melting ice sheets, retreating glaciers, sea level rise, ocean acidification, increased storm severity, like we're seeing with Hurricane Ian right now, shifts in biotic ranges, the evidence of a warming planet abounds. And this is both NASA as well as IPCC. And if we just look at where we're at for the last 800,000 years based on ice core data, we notice for the last 800,000 years, the level of CO2 has never approached this 1950 level until now. We can see the current level. Now, let me just kind of turn this graph around. Oops. No. God damn it. Let me just start over. Okay. I'll turn this graph around. Hopefully there we go. Okay, this is from now at 0 years before present, 450 years. This is the temperature range of the average global temperature range for the last 400,000 years. If we add to that the CO2 levels for the last 400,000 years, you see something very, very, very prominent. And that is CO2 and temperature is very, very closely correlated for the last 800,000 years. But what are we seeing today? We're seeing right now our current concentration of about 415 parts per million is unprecedented, hasn't ever been this high. So where's the temperature going to go? And of course, with the lower end projection of around 500 parts per million, we're in deep. If we don't do something now, in other words. We see this from our global temperature data, just the departure since 1880, again, slow rises up to about 1.2 degrees centigrade in much of the United States. And we can see that this is not all even. The darker the red, the higher the temperature range between 1895 and 2013, 18. And one of the things that really should stand out, obviously, that I'm sure you've all noticed, is Southeast Oregon. Southeast Oregon has risen, the temperatures have risen in Southeast Oregon amongst the highest of any area in the continental United States. This is going to have profound impacts on ecosystems such as Stevens Mountain, Hart Mountain, and virtually all of the Lakeview and Vale districts of the BLM. If we look at not only are we seeing increases in temperatures, we're seeing a much, much different environment. Changes in soil moisture, changes in plant moisture, which is from a fire science point of view is fuel moisture, giving us now much, much greater, over 200% increase in the number of fire weather days, the days in which a severe wildfire can occur. So we're seeing major shifts in, again, soil moisture, plant phenology, plant composition, differences in climate that are changing the natural fire regimes of our Southeast Oregon areas. Now, the good news is particularly in the last couple of years, federal agencies recognized it's essential for them to capture the full cost of greenhouse gas emissions. That's what I'm going to talk a lot about today, as accurately as possible. And this was both executive orders from the Biden administration as well as the Interior secretarial orders. And they state, particularly what we're interested in is the United States can reduce emissions from forest and agriculture and enhance carbon sinks through a range of programs and measures, including nature-based solutions for ecosystems ranging from our forest and agricultural soils to our rivers and coasts. So again, they have included USDA, U.S. Department of Interior, White House, that there's a role for natural resources and a very, very critical role throughout the world for forest and rangelands to be part of the climate solution. Now, what I want to talk about is kind of back up a little bit before we focus in on the West. Livestock grazing is a very, very significant part of natural resource management, the most widespread human influence on the planet. Deforestation of neotropical forest is predominantly for cattle pastures, such as here. This is an area in Amazon, deforested. You can see the forest in the background. Principal cause of desertification and degradation of the world's rangelands, whether it's the Western United States or the Sub-Saharan Africa, South America, Australia, what have you. The livestock sector emits about 7.1 million tons of CO2 equivalents per year, or 18%, that's billion tons, excuse me, of the total, that's 18% of the total anthropogenic greenhouse gas emissions, and that is very, very conservative. And of course, irrigated water from dams, heavily used to grow livestock forage. For example, the principal use of water of all California dams is livestock forage. And of course, they have major impacts on riparian zones, as you were just showing, streams which influence salmon, trout, terrestrial wildlife. Just really quickly, if cattle were their own nation, they'd be the world's third largest emitter from greenhouse gases, only behind China and the United States. And humans and livestock now account for about a quarter of the total terrestrial biomass on the planet. So we are the dominant creature on this planet. Okay, let's go back to the United States. Sad to say, about 85% of public lands in the Western United States are grazed by domestic livestock. The brown are all permits in the Western United States, and they influence climate change in 3 profound ways. But I just want to show you something that's really amazing. Is look at in Oregon, let's look at the number of livestock allotments there are. What percent, just give me a guess, what percent of livestock production comes from these lands in the United States, in Oregon?
Less than 5.
Nationally, less than 5.
2 to 3%.
It's nationally, yeah, I'll get to that. It's about 80% at best in Oregon, even though it looks like 2/3 of the area. But the livestock influences on climate change, and I want to talk about and come back to and give you some more details in 3 profound ways. You know, they defoliate native plants, they trample vegetation and soils, accelerate the spread of exotic species, and this results in a shift in landscape function from really significant carbon sinks historically, where they're absorbing carbon, now to very significant sources of greenhouse gases. The next way they affect climate change in profound ways is they exacerbate the effects of climate change. By creating warmer and drier conditions. The pictures you just showed in the riparian zone. The one thing that I found profound there was the one aspen tree in the background. There's no aspen underneath that. That should be an aspen forest right there. We see, big shifts from these wetland forested conditions to dry land conditions. And then finally, livestock themselves, through enteric fermentation, manure deposition, are very, very significant sources of greenhouse gases themselves. Okay, Oregon, just coming back, is really the dirty coal of agriculture. It's the dominant agricultural crop in Oregon, about 15% of all of our ag commodities, because Oregon is such a diverse agricultural state. But what's amazing is they account for 64% of the total emissions arising from the agricultural sector. So clearly, this is a place where the agricultural sector should be addressing this issue. And this is very, very conservative, because it doesn't count the other greenhouse gas emissions from, say, pasture management, pasture formation, fertilizer of pastures, the water in pastures, lining, off-farm emissions. It's not an entire life cycle analysis. Okay, if we get to trying to state now, what is the role that the public lands management agencies could afford, we need to look at what's the current management. Right now, if you look at the proposed Lakeview Resource Management Plan Environmental Impact Statement, their forage allocation for the Lakeview district is livestock at 86%. The deer and the antelope, where they play, get 8%, and the rest of the wildlife, the other 359 species, get 1%. So they're not focusing clearly on climate change at this point in time. Well, animal science has advanced. I want to say range management, and I'm a range management graduate from my bachelor's. It's not advanced. It hadn't advanced one iota, in my opinion, since I graduated in 1978. Animal unit months, you'll hear this talking a lot today. This is how we manage or measure the livestock numbers on public lands. It's the amount of forage required to feed one 1,000-pound cow and her calf for 1 month. Since the Taylor Grazing Act, this is what we've used, this animal unit month, one 1,000-pound cow. Now, range management hasn't changed, but animal science has greatly advanced. Right now, the mean weight of a cow, well, in 1990 was about 1,200 pounds. By 2015, it was 1,348 pounds. So really, when you're putting one cow and one calf on the land now, it's about 1.3 AUMs, not 1.0 AUMs. Yet the federal agencies have never recognized a shift in these livestock weights. Coming back to what we were saying earlier, less than 2.7% of all livestock operators in the United States enjoy the privilege of commercial access to these public lands. So 97.3 are producing on private lands, and I'm just focusing again on public lands. But if you look at all beef cattle in the United States, about 1.6% of the forage consumed by beef cattle comes from public lands. So it's a steep price to pay for a small amount of beef. Again, coming back to animal science advancing range management has it, grazing practices employed on public lands have changed very, very little. Probably the most common grazing system on BLM lands is deferred rotational grazing. This was first recommended in 1913, 1914. Rest rotation grazing came in almost 80 years ago in the 1950s, and we've seen very little shifts in how we manage lands in that time. But given the climatic changes in the Western United States, the grazing systems currently being utilized are no longer relevant. You know, the deferred grazing might be grazed early in the year, but take the cows off while there's still soil moisture. Well, there's no soil moisture anymore. The fire weather data tells us this, that it's just simply not possible to use these same grazing systems under today's climate and achieve the same results that they were hoping to get then. Really never have gotten great results anyway. Further, if you're a livestock operator, this is going to be a great concern. Storage quality during the summer through winter months is becoming lower and lower and lower. It's drying up, but they're eating straw now. So there's also increasing abundance of annuals is the other expectation with climate change. And we see that this decrease in forest quality is not only going to lower the fitness of the livestock on the area because it's higher in fiber, lower in digestible energy, but those are the very components that increase greenhouse gas emissions. So the animals will either be putting out more greenhouse gas emissions through enteric ferment. It's harder to digest, and so the little microbes in the rumen has to work harder, so they produce more methane, so they have a hard time. So it's worse as climate change increases. Okay, so first one, let me just give you some examples of shifts from sinks to sources. This is actually a large exclosure in Yellowstone National Park, but you can see the area is ungrazed by large herbivores, in this case, confined bison versus on the outside. Large animals, livestock, can affect ranks really, really simply. Just think about 4 things that livestock can do. They walk around and they eat, they remove herbage, they trail and they trample, like in my analysis last week. They disperse exotics either through feces or carrying them around, and they ruminate, they defecate.
Really bad.
So what we see then is these then have these interacting effects of changing fire cycles, increasing erosion, altering soils and hydrology, altering competitive interactions to where less palatable species start to overtake the very palatable biologically diverse species like the willows start to decline, the aspens start to decline. We see increased greenhouse gas emissions because we're shifting from sinks now to sources of greenhouse gases. All of these interact to simplify vegetation structure, to lower biological diversity, to degrade stream systems, to decline, again, in net ecosystem productivity, which is how we measure the carbon cycling in these areas. All of these, work to exacerbate climate change, lower our resistance and resilience to climate change, lower our ability to sequester carbon. And all of these, of course, ultimately affect who I think we're really working for. I think for future generation, our children, our grandchildren, lost options for future kids. So let me just give you some examples from Oregon of ecosystem degradation due to grazing or vegetation change, like planting crested wheatgrass or the loss of our native rangelands and conversion to exotic grassland. So you can see juniper woodland had an average above ground carbon stock of about 18 tons per hectare. The basin big sage, the big tall sage, about 7.8. Mountain big sage, about 5.8, and Wyoming big sage, the very abundant one that you see in the lower elevation, say of Heart Mountain, about 2.6 tons. But when you convert these areas to crested wheatgrass or through poor long-term management cheatgrass, we see dramatic declines in the carbon stock, about an 84% decline in the above ground biomass, the above ground carbon stocks, even when these Wyoming big sagebrush are converted to, say, crested wheatgrass, 88% when they're lost to cheatgrass, but you can see like 98, 95% when these larger sagebrush juniper communities are converted. So big losses due to either purposeful land use or poor land management. Let's move to the riparian zones, and this is where we really see big differences. These are some data from the Middle Fork of the John Day River, where we looked at in exposures, grazed versus ungrazed dry meadows and grazed versus ungrazed wet meadows. And what we find is, first of all, in the wet meadows, the root biomass is almost 30,000 tons per acre. No, that's 30,000 pounds per acre, tons per hectare. That's about the same as a tropical rainforest in the Amazon. There's that much roots in these healthy riparian meadows. When they're grazed, or we see these are areas that have been ungrazed for about 10 years, we saw 5,466 kilograms per hectare differences. In the dry meadows, 10,961 differences in grazed versus ungrazed wet meadows, 49% increase, 62% increase in ungrazed sites. But what we see then is, in terms of shifting these ecosystems from sources of carbons to sinks of carbon, we see a carbon gain of averaging 5.4 in the dry meadow and 12 in the wet meadow, 12 tons of carbon per hectare per year. And so you see that if the social cost of carbon is $51 per ton, this is far, far more valuable, particularly to the American people, than the red meat that's being produced that's degrading these sites. Finally, I'll just say this, and I'll show you later, is these numbers are really conservative, because what we see in many of our sites is a shift through time. When you quit grazing the dry meadows, they shift to wet meadows through time. So these numbers are quite, I think, conservative here. Second thing I want to talk about, exacerbating the effects of climate through the creation of warmer and drier conditions, similar to what I've already mentioned with the pictures that you showed of the aspen. And here's just a great example of Guano Creek at Heart Mountain. When the last year the cows were on Heart Mountain, and today you see these dramatic shifts in wetlands throughout this area. If anybody ever wants any of these pictures of Heart Mountain, I'd be happy to share. So what we see then is halting grazing. And again, here's a study from 11 different streams throughout northeastern Oregon, the John Day and Grand Ronde systems. We see that halting grazing increases the abundance of sedges and other productive wetland systems. Now what it is we did a paired study of 11 sites, inside and outside, small exclosures. If they're exactly the same, if the composition doesn't change, it's going to be right along the red line here. If the sedge cover is higher in the ungrazed sites, they're going to be on this side of the line. Sedge covers are the sedges, sedges are the wetland grasses. And if they're below the line, that means they would be more abundant in the grazed section. So what we see then in all 11 sites, we see an increase in these wetland species. And then if we just take the entire composition, 212 or 13 different species, and then ascribe them to wetland indicator scores, we see the same thing. Again, the lower the score here, the greater the wetland. So if the dots below the line here would suggest that the wetlands there's more wetland vegetation. There's overall increases in the wetland composition and the exposures compared to the grazed areas. You can see in all 11 sites, and these were really interesting because they're areas of different ages, different composition, different land management on the outside. So what it does show is regardless of land management of time since exclosure, the wetland species are higher in the exclosures than the grazed areas. Okay, and then finally, one other one kind of coming to is the increases in exotic species. Poa pratensis is a Kentucky bluegrass is an exotic species that dominates many wetlands. It's that dominant species in dry meadows. And here we see then in 9 of 11 sites, a decrease in the exotic species in the ungrazed sites compared to the grazed sites. And this is something very similar. This is some of our work, and I'm sorry, this is a terrible slide because this is the first time I've ever shown it. But this is just the abundance of 2 exotic species that are very common in our parent zones in the Western United States, Kentucky bluegrass and meadow timothy. It's that timothy, you know, meadow timothy, it looks like a little ear corn, you know, little chipmunks are always eating it. But at any rate, and here we see, and this is the MIM methodology that we used here, so you can do this too, is a stream bank disturbance. This was a series of 7 different streams, 8 different streams, excuse me. As stream bank disturbance increased by the MIM methodology, we saw increases in the abundance of exotic species. In other words, areas without grazing, without heavy animal use, had fewer exotic species than areas with high disturbance. And again, similar to here, stubble heights were the same way, linear relationship. The lower the stubble height, the greater the abundance of these exotic species. So again, this is the power of using some of this MIM methodology. You get really good quantitative data if you got the species composition with it. But coming back to our 11 exclosures in Northeastern Oregon, you know, I did the vegetation aspects, but many of my colleagues were working on fish, on streams, on channel structure. And our overall data is we found increases in the exclosures. We found increases in shrub cover, increases in herbaceous cover, increases in the number of species, increases in diversity, wetland species composition, bare ground, channel depth, and channel increased while channel width decreased. These are very important features for both salmonids as well as affecting water quality. We found, you know, exclosures were small with a few differences in temperature, but we did see increases in the end of the year salmonids. We did see adult fish. Again, exclosures were only 1 to 2, 100 yards to a mile long. And we did see declines in warm water fishes, some of those being exotics. Okay, and again, one final example, another example, many of y'all have been to Barnharney Meadow or seen this picture of, here's the last year of grazing in Barnharney. And here's what it looks like today. You know, this huge shift from dryland vegetation, mostly again, Kentucky bluegrass to now sedge willow dominated ecosystem. Okay, one of the reasons why we see the shifts in composition is because we see shifts in soils. Soil bulk density is just how dense the soil is. You know, the lower the density, the more water it holds, the more air spaces you have, the easier it is for roots. You can stick your fingers in it. You know, it's like you're growing your raised bed. So what we found in comparing the wet meadows and the dry meadows is the bulk density in the grazed areas was about 0.65 in the wet meadow and about 1 in the exclosure. So what we're seeing is that we just have less water holding capacity, less ability for the water to flow in. And in fact, if we just look at, this is the infiltration rates. This is how fast the water during, say, a rainstorm or during snowmelt can flow into a stream. And what we see here, again, in the grazed areas, it's up to 12 times higher, the rates of infiltration in the ungrazed sites as the grazed sites, about 5 times higher in the wet meadow. But what this tells us then is that now we see in these intact areas, rather than the water washing over the riparian zone, eroding soils and not staying on site, goes straight into the stream with dirt and carries it downstream. in the areas, when the areas become, in the ungrazed areas, rather, the water soaks into the ground. You have that greater bulk density, greater water holding capacity, staying cooler, slower release to the channel, giving us cooler water later in the season and replenishing groundwater. So overall, just to give you some real quick examples, on the Middle Fork of the John Day, the upper Middle Fork, many of y'all know with Dunstan Ranch where TNC is, and the area is now owned by the Warm Springs, the Oxbow. Saturated soils just in the top 4 inches, 10 centimeters, would have about 61,000 more liters. What's that? 18,000 gallons more water than equivalent grazed hectare. And the wet meadows, 121,000 more liters. We just did the upper 30 kilometers, say below Greenhorn of the river of the Middle Fork. There were 145 hectares of dry meadow, 64 of wet. And if we excluded that entire area, we get about 4.3 million more gallons of water that would be stored in the riparian zone. Again, this is incredibly important for climate change. And this is why we're exacerbating climate change, because we don't have that capacity to store the water on the landscape. Okay, finally, I just want to say that livestock on public lands are very significant sources of greenhouse gases, methane, nitrous oxide in particular, through enteric fermentation, and particularly at this time of year when they're grazing really, really poor quality forages. Greenhouse gas emissions, basically for this part of the analysis, we used EPA data and data from the Forest Service and the BLM National Grazing Statistics. The default value, EPA has amazing data on livestock and emissions, but basically a cow and a calf, you get about 111 kilograms, that'd be 230 or so pounds of methane a year. Nitrous oxide from the manure on the range, about 1.4 to 2.4 kilograms. But remember, these are very, very potent greenhouse gases. The global warming potential of methane is about 86 times that of on a 50-year cycle, is about 86 times that of carbon dioxide, and nitrous oxide is 268 times more potent greenhouse gas than CO2. And this is how we can then, calculate all of these, balance all of these using what we call carbon dioxide equivalents by multiplying, say, methane, the amount of methane by 86 and the amount of nitrous oxide by 268. So that's sort of what we're doing here. So therefore, if we put everything in carbon dioxide equivalents, and we do this because this is how we trade carbon on global markets. If you value carbon, it's usually on a CO2 equivalence basis. So what we calculate then, the EPA has calculated that the CO2 equivalent of a cow calf on the rangeland in Oregon is 9,000, or in the Western United States, 9,756 kilograms of CO2 from methane and 756 kilograms CO2 equivalents for the nitrous oxide. And for every AUM then, that's about 875 kilograms of CO2 produced from the rangelands. Okay. So now we take those numbers and multiply it by the numbers of animals on Western public lands. From enteric fermentation and manure alone, there's about 12.35 million tons of CO2 produced on our public lands every year. That's equal to about 2,661,000 gas vehicles per year. That's equivalent to over almost 1.4 billion gallons of gasoline. That's equivalent to 1.6 million homes heated for 1 year, or about the electricity use for 2.4 million. This exceeds all the housing use. Every single house from Portland to John Day, it exceeds that electricity use. And the amount of carbon sequestered, it would be the amount of carbon loss is the amount of carbon that would be sequestered from over 14,617,000 acres of US forest in 1 year. So we're talking about a very, very significant quantity of greenhouse gases. Just for your bushel basket of knowledge, a single cow produces about the same emissions as 2.3 cars driven per year, unless you drive a Rende truck, which is far more. And these are all, again, you can get these numbers from the EPA carbon calculator. Okay, so what then are the social costs? I want to kind of put this in a monetary cost to give you an idea of how valuable our grazing on public land. The social cost of carbon is what we're using throughout government, throughout the world, throughout the United Nations process to estimate the monetized damage associated with increases in greenhouse gas emissions, including impacts on global warming, productivity, human health, loss of property, infrastructure, sea level rise, extreme weather events, diminished biodiversity, ecosystem services. It also then would represent the marginal social benefits if we stop it, if we have emissions reductions. And this is something that we can very, very easily measure on public lands. The social cost of carbon is right now at $51 per ton, with methane and nitrous oxide emissions at $1,500 per ton and $18,000 because of that greater global warming potential, because they're so much more powerful greenhouse gases. And this is just, again, what I've stated. But one thing that's really interesting, and this is why climate change, you have to stay on top of it, is that a paper came out this week, yesterday or Tuesday, when I was preparing, when I was preparing for this presentation, rendered that out, comprehensive evidence implies a higher social cost of CO2. And this is in Nature magazine, one of the most prestigious journals in the world. They stated that using the latest science, they suggest that the social cost of carbon is actually closer to $185 per ton. That's a value 3.6 times greater than the government's values and the numbers that I'm giving you today, $51 a ton. So if anything else, in reality, the numbers that I'm giving here are really, really conservative. Just to give you real quickly, there's a whole lot of ways to calculate social cost of carbon. You know, we did it using the social cost of carbon of nitrous and methane. You can use the global warming potential at 20, which is a different number than the global warming potential at 100 years. What most people suggest, and the IPCC default values, which are extremely conservative and a great underestimate and really not very good science. So what it would come down to then is we selected the NO2 and CH4 at a $35 total social cost per AUM. And the reason why we did this is because it's closer to, you know, we're not changing, we're not converting to CO2 equivalents. And so, you know, many people would suggest using the higher number because the global warming potential 20, because we have very little time to get climate change under control. And of course, the global warming, the lower ones would be at the lower end. So basically taking the middle value of 35.50 is a pretty good way to at least have our discussion today. So what are the true costs of grazing on public lands? Federal grazing fee right now is, as you all know, probably $1.35 per AUM for public lands. And that's for managed BLM. Someone said last week, I believe it was on NPR, it wasn't on Fox News, that you can't feed a goldfish for $1.35 per AUM. And my friend Mark always said he couldn't feed his pet gerbil for $1.35 a month, but that's what we charge for a 1,300 or 1,400 pound cow and her calf. The estimated social cost of greenhouse gases is about $35.50 per AUM, and that's 26 times that of the federal grazing fee. The social cost of greenhouse gases and manure, therefore, from grazing public lands in, was about $501 million last year, and every year before that. Administrative costs for managing livestock, they've been estimated $8 to $12 per AUM. In other words, for every $1.35 you bring in, it takes about $8 to $12 to manage that. Therefore, if we add then the social cost to these administrative costs, excess administrative costs, the total cost to the US taxpayers and society and future generations for grazing a single animal unit month on public land is at least $42 to $48. Okay, so combining management costs with social cost of the more than 15.4 million AUMs of livestock that graze public lands, the total cost of public land grazing to the public exceeds $101 million per year. We can feed a lot of children with that. And that's a cost, again, that's 38 times that brought to the US Treasury by the grazing fees. Okay, and these are, again, way underestimates, because I'm not including, because I don't even have good enough data yet to include all the carbon losses from rangelands. So it does include increased emissions through sequestration of the landscape. We also didn't add social costs due to losses in water quality, water quantity, biological diversity, fisheries losses, tourism, other ecosystem services negatively affected by livestock. And again, these are great underestimates of the true cost of cattle on public lands. So the social cost of carbon represents marginal social benefits of emission. So what would happen? So let's turn this around. Those are costs. What about social benefits if we took cows off public lands? And this is really, I think, a common sense approach to dealing with the climate crisis, given their incredible cost to the public and really marginal addition to US food supply. So we end livestock grazing, it'd be a social benefit immediately at $500 million a year in decreased social carbon costs. In addition, it would be an effective climate change mitigation approach. We'd see shifts in sources of greenhouse gases to sinks of greenhouse gases, such as we saw in that riparian example I gave you. We'd see cessation, we'd see reducing or increasing climate resilience. You know, we have cooler conditions, we have conditions more appropriate for the survival of say, bird species that are very much at their temperature margins right now. And then finally, other ecosystem services are improved, particularly water quality, flood buffering, soil health, and fish and wildlife habitat diversity, and probably this 1.7% of the nation's beef supply that would be lost by grazing could be more than made up for through better water management downstream on the public lands that are in the private lands that are much more suitable for grazing livestock. So to finish up then, another favorite quote is Mark Twain is, we've got to get away from denial. Denial's more than a river in Egypt. And livestock are a significant problem and an opportunity to address the climate crisis. So some of the possible actions we can take, we certainly need to increase public awareness of the cost of private cattle grazing on public lands. We need to encourage public land managers to address climate change in a meaningful way, as is listed on their website right now, that they are committed to dealing with climate change. And, you know, and the reality is that it's hard to believe that BLM is probably the largest polluter in Lake County. It's probably the largest polluter in Vail because of this the extremely high numbers of cows on their lands. We need to support rewilding efforts for large areas of public lands in the American West, where we are managing, we are eliminating those actions that are causing degradation or preventing recovery, such as livestock grazing, but at the same time, restoring keystone species such as wolves and beavers, stopping the trapping of beaver, you know, no limit. I mean, start to manage wolves at ecologically viable populations instead of the minimal viable population that so many wildlife agencies are doing today. And finally, there is legislation out there that to retire grazing allotments in a fair and equitable manner. And this is the HR 6935, the Voluntary Grazing Permanent Reduction Act by Smith in Washington and Representative Huffman from California. And I'm leaving this, if y'all want, you know, I'm leaving this talk with y'all so y'all can use these slides later. So why is it important to act now? We're at a tipping point. We've got a decade, so we may be beyond the tipping point already. But failure to act now is clearly depriving future generations of ecosystem services, values that we've enjoyed from natural ecosystems, the things that we've got to see from natural ecosystems. I had a great trip last week. I walked on the Timberline Trail around Mount Hood, but I finished the trip with a tear in my eye because I walked up to, do you remember the Palmer chairlift, which used to always be the one that you had year-round skiing on? It was dry. There's not a flake of snow underneath the Palmer chairlift right now. And of course, you know, the glaciers are clearly greatly receded. So nature-based solutions are of great value in meeting the emissions reductions targets. You know, clearly this is what the U.S. Department of Interior and Agriculture could do on their lands to reduce greenhouse gas emissions as well as preserve biological diversity, other ecosystem services. You know, these intact systems are going to be more resistant to stresses from a changing climate. They're actually going to slow, or at least, you know, slow like fire spread in many conditions. And they have a higher degree of resilience or a capacity to recover. So with that, I just want to thank you all. I want to thank the employees of federal agencies who compiled the data presented here. I want to thank the Oregon Natural Desert Association who provided me with the impetus to do this analysis, this large analysis. The Oregon State Ecosystem Restoration Fund, Oregon State Diversity Ecosystem, which funded much of this work, and my co-authors, Bob Besch and Bart Liverman in the back, Matt Lacey. And also all of my students and colleagues and cooperators, landowners who contributed so much to these studies. With that, I'm happy to answer.
So I guess is there questions?
We should also check the chat. I'll check the chat box.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, when I read your paper, I mean, I was stunned by the numbers, as I'm sure everyone else was. I'm curious, what are your thoughts about, or what are your plans, or do you have plans for going to the next step and analyzing some of the other contributions?
Yeah.
Because as you pointed out, you know, at many layers, it's very conservative.
Yeah.
You know, and so that's great to keep it sort of safe and conservative. And there are other pieces that,
Right.
you know, we haven't been able to look at yet. And so are you thinking about that next step, and what does that look like?
Yeah, I just got finished talking to USGS the other day because, you know, what we really need is better soil carbon data from sagebrush and riparian zones and ecosystems. Get an idea of, you know, the enteric fermentation numbers are astounding. It's the numbers, I think, from losing juniper, losing sagebrush, losing riparian zone, that's going to dwarf these enteric fermentation numbers and carbon losses. So these numbers, again, may be only half of the true total carbon loss on these lands. So that would be the first thing that I would approach. What really needs to be done, I think, is better ideas of the loss of carbon from the landscape. And I'm sad to say that, you know, I've been doing this for a long time in the Amazon and in mangroves throughout the world, but it's harder to get funding for sagebrush and riparian zones.
What's the status of HR 6935 right now?
You know, I think it's in, I have no idea.
Can you repeat the question, just make sure that.
Oh, she asked what the status of the bill, the HR 6935, the retiring of the grazing allotments. I don't, does anybody know what that might be?
Probably just sort of hanging around in the back of the line.
Yeah.
But that is also because there's another bill in the Senate that Burton Heinrich, senator from New Mexico, introduced, and it's moving, and it would authorize grazing permit retirement in the state of New Mexico on all federal lands, Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service. And so while Representative Smith's bill is a great messaging vehicle, sets a base, if you will, for talking about grazing permit retirement and the value to public lands, ranchers, other constituencies. Martin Heinrich is going to see it's almost like a football game. If he can do an end run and come around and score a touchdown in the Senate, and if we can get voluntary grazing permit retirement in New Mexico, then the dominoes will fall, right? And states like Oregon and Nevada and Idaho might come next. And so Martin Heinrich's bill in the Senate is moving, has gotten a hearing, and is available for a markup and potentially even enactment this fall.
What's the number of that bill?
That,
Unless somebody has a phone. I already looked up the other one, in fact, checked you while you were talking.
Just a Google away.
oh, what's the number?
I don't know, it'll take me a second.
Okay. Just wait for it, just wait.
Yeah.
So is there a way for then the public to weigh in on it? What's the strategic time? For people
Well,
just.
the Senate will adjourn in another week or two, so they can all go home and campaign.
That's right.
And Congress doesn't want to work too hard, so they try to take a lot of breaks. But they will be back after the election, so I think like the second week of November, and they will be working away. I have a bet with Ryan that they will not finally sort of gavel out the session until December 23rd. Because they will see if they can't get some more bills or as many bills passed as they want. And some of that will depend on how the election goes in November. They will have different motivations, different parties will have different motivations on whether and how to engage and collaborate on legislation depending on the outcome of the election.
So if the Senate one could get through, that would be a good thing, because it would likely happen. Okay.
Yeah, no, I would also just add to that, right now the price of beef is actually decreasing because of the nationwide drought, where there's less water available. There's a lot more impetus for grazers right now. And there's no future for grazing on these public land. It's a good impetus. It's a good to get. I would take the money and run if I was a grazing person, because it's not going to be economically feasible to graze these lands, but we're going to take down a lot of biological diversity and productivity with it if we don't hesitate, as we hesitate.
I have a question. Oh, sorry, can I ask this question from the chat, so I don't keep them waiting for too long? This is from Carolyn. Question for you.
Okay.
If someone believes in climate change and how humans impact it, do you have a 30-second elevator speech for them that will help them get the connection between eating meat and dairy and climate change?
Yeah. Well, I think that I would say that, that I might start off on a 30-second elevator stand that the incredible impacts that livestock have on climate change, that if they were their own nation, they'd be the third largest producer of greenhouse gases. And I didn't include this in the thing, but that equates to the deaths of hundreds of people per year, the losses of thousands of tons of agricultural products due to climate change and ozone, et cetera, per year. The fact that there are climate-friendly alternatives to beef, virtually anything except shrimp, farm-raised shrimp, that would be a way to decrease your global carbon footprint, though. And not to mention the other impacts of global desertification, principal causes of deforestation in the tropical rainforest, losses of salmon habitat throughout the West. So.
That's more than 30 seconds, but it's pretty
Okay.
good.
They could pull that down.
Carolyn says thank you.
You're welcome. You had it.
Yeah, I appreciate several of your comments about denial. We need to get past denial. But there's 5 stages of grief, and acceptance is stage 5. Stage 2 is anger. And the stages don't have to come in order, and they don't have to only go once, but it's very predictable that the more this issue surfaces in Congress, that there's going to be a lot of angry people who are going to want to own the libs. There'll be a lot of jokes about cow farts and how we hate beef and how we hate ranchers and so on. What are some thoughts about getting past that? I think offering money is one thing. Some people, maybe this question is too broad. Some people have said that you can reduce enteric fermentation effects by feeding cows seaweed.
Yeah.
I just wonder if there's other ways to approach this besides taking cows off the land that lead to so much anger.
This is where this is what people really, the answer to much of that is what people would really hate is that the most efficient way, the greenest beef you could probably eat in terms of greenhouse gases is feedlot beef, because they produce the least amount of enteric fermentation, and you can feed them seaweed in that scenario. You can't feed them seaweed out on the range. It would be far cost of, they have to eat a certain amount of seaweed every day, although that's not even, that jury is not out, because one thing, where you get all the seaweed from, you're going to destroy seagrass, you're going to destroy coral reefs as you grow this stuff. And second of all, it does cause increased ulcers in cattle when they eat the seaweed as well. So that's actually, I'm going to be discussing this subject next week in a meeting. But that won't work on rangelands. But what will work, what my approach would be, I would use the monetary value. It's not a cost-effective way. It's if you're a conservative, why would you give away $500 million a year plus $136 million in administrative costs? That's welfare ranching. Especially.
So I have a question. I tried to look this up the other day and couldn't find current data, but I'm curious if Oregon has current economic projections of the age of ranchers in our state, which is vastly aging, and how these rangeland family farms are not taking up mom and pop's operations. Right. So I'm just wondering that part, and then I have a two-part question. I can ask them separately. They're not related, but yeah. I can ask the second part. So the second part is, since you've done so much international work, I'm curious if you're worried about the shift of cows off of American landscapes putting pressure on other countries for our cultural need for beef.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that's one of the biggest questions that I get is the leakage is if we take the cows off here, will we get with it? The answer is probably not. We import very little beef into the United States. But let me get back to that. But coming back to the average age of ranchers certainly well into their 50s or early 60s. I think, the average, there's no average age of the largest amount of permittees because they're usually corporations and not individuals. But I think there is an impetus to, there might be an impetus of retirement as to retire your grazing permits. The leakage question is a really, really big one. And even if on the United States, one of the aspects is that this is the worst way to raise animals in terms of producing the greatest amount of greenhouse gases, because the forage quality is so low. It takes it over. These animals are not built for rangeland. These are European beef breeds that were raised and evolved in barns and are not suitable for semi-arid mountainous rangeland. So even if we did not, even just taking the animals off the land, you'd get, first of all, a huge carbon sequestration benefit from this vast area of land now sequestered carbon. At the same time, the individual animal would be producing fewer greenhouse gases. And that's measurable greenhouse gases. You get this from EPA on the percent lowered greenhouse gas emissions. So yes, so where are they? What we need to do is I hate to see that, what's sad to say is that most of the deforestation in the Amazon, for example, is domestic consumption of beef. Very little is exported actually out of the Amazon. The global beef supply might not be as big of a concern as even the nation's beef supply, as the leakage aspect. But a really, really good point and something that needs to be addressed.
Okay, so if we got all the cows off of public lands, how would that compare to the impacts we would have if we got them off of public and private land?
Oh, we're talking about 1.7, probably 2 or 3% of the total emissions from the livestock industry in total, except for, again, the carbon sequestration that we get from the public land. So this is just a great step. You know, what this is just a plea to once again, it's not a cost-effective approach to the American public. It's costing us and future generations, you know, $500 to $700 million per year. You know, we would get greater mitigation and adaptation of our lands for the future through removing the livestock. And then we can, and then start addressing public lands grazing by, you know, other means of reducing emissions and or, you know, changing the American diet.
Right.
I know I didn't completely answer your
Well, I'm
question.
just curious, okay, if I understand what you're saying, it's a very small percentage
Yeah,
in terms of the total damage that cattle.
right.
In the
Yeah, the
US.
cattle industry.
So it's more like, well, we're using this as an example or, you know, to lead the way of
Mhm.
perhaps produce, you know, having fewer cattle in the US. Is there anything going on that is addressing the issue of all the pollution that cattle
Yeah.
cause that aren't on public lands?
You know, I find it just incredible that DEQ is not addressing this. You know, it's like I gave you that example earlier, Oregon DEQ. You know, they're 15% of the farm gate, but 60% of the emissions. If I was in the agricultural industry, I'm in the College of Ag Sciences, you know, I would be going, you know, like, hey, you're giving us a bad name here, you know, let's see if we can get these emissions down. So they should stand out as for criticism in the agriculture industry as being such a polluting a means of producing food. You know, it's a luxury item, you know, for sure. So.
I know this wasn't the emphasis of this talk, but is anyone in your lab or anyone in the university looking at wildlife in grazing ungrazed areas and the impacts that grazing has on wildlife? There's a study in Arizona that shows differences between where it's grazed and ungrazed, and the impacts on birds has been incredible. And then when they took off the cows, all these birds came back in these areas. And I think that can really, I mean, it doesn't show the differences in as far as climate change, but it does really give a message of what these changes can do to something outside of that.
Right. No, there are, I think there's several really good, I think probably the most notable ones would be some of what's gone on in Hart Mountain and the recovery of bird species and bird populations, small mammal populations there, where they are dramatically, you know, and particularly in the riparian zones, in the aspen communities, they're recovering. So that'd be the first place that I'd look for greater information. But you know, and there's a lot of good studies that are coming out, like, you know, again, if you, that one picture we're showing of aspen, you know, we have some sites, you know, exclosures in the Gallatin and on Yellowstone, where the exclosures are 40-foot, 50-foot tall aspen on one side and sagebrush in the grazed areas. You know, but you walk into these areas and it's like walking into an air conditioning, you know, it's 10 degrees cooler inside the soils. You can stick your fingers right in the soils and you can't even, you know, begin on the outside. You know, the soils are black on the inside and brown on the outside. But, you know, but that microclimate difference and that greater moisture content differences is huge differences, spells for huge differences in habitats. You know, the structural diversity is remarkably different, but also the cooler conditions are now creating refugia for these species to survive in a changing climate. So I think that there's some good work on that, mostly in forested ecosystems, less so in riparian ecosystems.
But these are, this study is in riparian areas where they actually took the cows off. And it really got a lot of the public attention that, it really makes a difference in the number of birds that are really occupying that.
Yeah, because it's Arizona.
We have a question from Suzanne. This is going back now a few minutes to when we were discussing putting pressure on agencies. Suzanne says, this is great information, thank you. However, what are ways to put pressure on agencies when they get so much deference from the legal system? And how to put pressure on the range programs and agencies who often do not collect data that is reproducible. They don't monument their sites and rely on this deference. The agencies don't seem to care because the ranchers are the people who matter to them. So how to apply pressure on agencies in that, with that context?
I was hoping to get the Broads to do that. I thought that's what y'all did.
Any suggestions for us?
Well, I was trying to say, I would say Congress, it needs to be, it doesn't get the attention that it really should be getting. The most widespread land use on public lands. And, you hardly even hear other environmental groups mentioning it. Sierra Club doesn't mention it hardly at all. Some of the larger Nature Conservancy, et cetera, they don't mention it to an extent, but I think talking to the public like this, getting out, talking to our Congress people, talking to, maybe trying to get it more into the newspapers. This morning in the Gazette Times in Corvallis, we had the rewilding paper was published in the editorial section. So
That's because you're liberals over there. It's hard to get, it would just be disaster over here. I mean, we would get what they call tarred and feathered.
Well, that's why you're lucky that you live over here. You're going to listen to me.
And I would say your paper's doing the rounds.
Yeah, that's good to hear.
You and I were in DC in early June. Remember that? Yeah, the director of the BLM picked up that paper
All right.
and was like, wow, we need to rethink social cost of carbon, don't we? And so, I mean, it was.
All right. I'm glad to hear
The
that.
director's office, BLM in June in DC. So it's doing the rounds. And I think as the nature paper you cited, cranks that number up quite a bit.
Yeah.
And maybe as we get to soil carbon and all that, and they said from their perspective, they have to do different types of economic analysis based on sort of the tier of impact. And they basically said, oh my, this might take us into a new tier. Because the numbers are different. So it's slow, but it was there. And it was really cool to hear that when Mark and I were there.
It was also fun to hear how it arrived on their desk.
Yes.
Mac, Lacey, who's Robin's co-author, posted something on social media. Hey, we just published something. I took Mac's social media thing and said, hey, look what Mac just did. And my friend, who's now the science director at the U.S. Department of Defense, said, what's that? And downloaded it and sent it to his staff. Wow. In Washington State. It happened in about 4 days.
Exactly. So it's, keep it going.
Yeah, it's hard to get
Just
it.
keep it going.
I think as you keep publishing these kinds of papers, it provides at least the people who are doing advocacy
Mhm.
more ammunition to go after this.
Exactly.
Like ANDA and WWP and advocates, they're the ones who are trying to litigate for these bad actions, but they give undue deference to the other enforcers.
Yeah, they do. And those conversions into the numbers that you showed up there, numbers of miles driven, or numbers of houses, numbers of gasoline, gallons of gasoline, those are the conversions that hit people. When you can say, whatever it was, again, 14 gallons.
2.3 cars.
Exactly. Every car is 2.3 cars.
Yeah.
Those are the numbers that hit people. Because all the other stuff kind of goes past them because it's a little complicated to understand.
Yeah.
But those translations are very powerful. And so as we talk about your paper, we work on those translations to turn it into, numbers of cows, numbers of miles driven, that kind of stuff.
Can you share your presentation?
Oh, absolutely. I made this for the Broad, so y'all.
It's gonna be on YouTube with all the flaws that we. But I will be sending that to everyone.
What do you do? Copy the presentation?
Oh, yes, we can do that. Yeah, we can get the slides. Certainly send me the slides, but it will be on YouTube and we will take the recording and send it to everyone who's participated, and probably to the Broads, and you're welcome to distribute it however.
We do have another.
Yeah, feel free to post it online.
Yeah, you could post it and then, post it.
Got lots of thank yous.
Should have worn a clean shirt.
We also have a question from Hillary asking, are sheep as bad or worse than cows?
They're equipped, they're ruminant animals, so they are every bit as bad, but it just takes 5 of them versus 1. So on a weight by weight basis, they do produce about the same amount of greenhouse gases. as a cow does. So no worse, no better.
Yeah.
You know, it's ruminant animals. If you just look at the greenhouse gas emissions from ruminants, they're all high, whether it's cattle, sheep, goats, bison being grazed as domestic animals, less so for pigs and chickens. So if you eat meat, you could eat chicken or pig.
So did you say we can eat chicken?
It'd be a greener alternative.
Greener.
There are graphs online too that you can.
Yes, there are. There's really good graphs.
Especially with the equivalents of, oh my gosh, I'm brain farting on the other gas, nitrous.
Nitrous oxide.
Yeah, nitrous oxide, just understanding like how scary that gas is.
All right.
Well, if you have any recommendations on for broads, and we're just starting into this whole advocacy issue on livestock grazing. Because we've been involved in forestry issues and other issues, but do you have any suggestions on things we could do differently? Or
Well, you know, who I would ask that question, you know, Mary O'Brien, don't you? Didn't she found the broads? You know, she's a great one. She's been a lifelong, I've known her since I was a petite young man. She's always been my hero, but she would be a great one to talk to because she's been an advocate for.
Yeah, she clamps onto a stimulation and she doesn't let go. I mean, it's just, she takes it all away. So, yeah, she's on the board with the Great Old Broads and we have good access.
But yeah, any information that I can give you, we get it out to the general public or social medias.
Well, just this presentation was fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I want to do a good job because I have so much respect for y'all. So.
Well,
And I would just let you know, and I don't have the date by the top of my head, that our next broad chat next month is Marina Ritchie, and she's going to be giving a presentation on kingfisher and the impacts of climate on the kingfisher birds.
right,
And she does have a book that's coming out, so she'll talk
it's
about.
out.
It's out, the book is out. So
Yeah,
that's
connection of kingfishers with rivers and streams and climate change.
right. So that's next month. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.